Hey everyone, my name is Kara Oostraus, and I'm a University of Calgary grad in the Communication and Media Studies program, as well as a reporter with Real Agriculture, and I will be hosting today's webinar. Thanks everyone for tuning in and joining us on this wonderful Wednesday. It is a beautiful hot day. Most of you, I'd assume, are in Alberta in the Calgary area, and it is supposed to be a scorcher, so everybody stay cool. The School of Public Policy is Canada's leading policy school, known for their practical research and for bringing people together to discuss the important issues with experts, which is what we are here to do today. Before we get started, there are just a few quick housekeeping notes we have to address. If you have to leave early, recordings of the webinar are posted on the School of Public Policy website, and you'll receive a link in the follow-up email. Please type your questions in the Q&A box below, and we will pose them to our speakers after the discussion. Today's topic is grains, essential and sustainable, looking forward. And we have three speakers with us here today. We have Craig Shand, who is a senior agronomist and owner with Chinook Agronomics Incorporated. Jason Lenz, who is an owner and partner with Lenz Farms, a director with Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions and the Canada Grains Council, and Tom Steve, who is a general manager of Alberta Wheat and Barley Commissions. Before we get into the Q&A and presentations, I'm going to give you a little bit of context on what we're talking about here today. In 2017, a major federal government report pinpointed 4 areas that could help grow Canada's economy in an exceptional way. Agriculture and agri-foods was at the top of this list. Canada currently exports the majority of its wheat production, and the international market will continue to grow rapidly as Southeast Asia, China, and India populations continue to grow and their middle class demands increase. Layered into this is the immediate need for Canada to kickstart its economy into recovery and growth mode post-COVID-19. In March 2020, the agriculture and agri-food sector was deemed essential. This session discusses why, as the grain industry prepares to be a strong part of Canada's economic recovery, it has more to offer than just economic positives. It is focused on sustainability as well and can help the world manage greenhouse gas emissions and develop sustainable practices while meeting global demand market for grains. Canada currently exports 70% of its wheat production, and that global demand is increasing. Canada's grain industry growth potential lies in fulfilling that market need. What are the sustainability implications of Canada continuing to expand its global export market of Canadian crops? This webinar will visit with experts in the grain sector to discuss its place as one of the 4 major pillars of growth and recovery for Canadian economy. How can it both be economical and sustainable? To start off, we'll hear from Tom, followed by Jason, and then last but not least, we'll hear from Craig. Tom, you can go ahead and take the field.
Okay, thanks very much, Kara, and welcome everyone. Just want to thank the School of Public Policy for this opportunity, and in particular the Simpson Centre, which is the new ag think tank at the U of C connected to the school. So if you can go to the first slide. I'd like to just give a little bit of a historical perspective, but this is more the state of affairs today in terms of Canadian grains, oilseeds, special crops. We're known for our quality, our consistency, our pristine environment, which is, I think, recognized worldwide, and that is definitely adds to our value proposition. The point is, and Kara made that point excellently, is we produce a lot more grain than we can possibly consume in Canada. And I think at the start of COVID-19, when we saw flour not available on the store shelves, people were panicking. But in reality, we have excess production. That was more of a logistics issue in terms of the inability of the millers to get the product onto the store shelves than really any real shortage. So if you want to go to the next slide. So these are the top 5 export destinations for Canadian crops. And you can see the United States is obviously an important customer, wheat in particular, but also canola. Mexico, Japan is probably our premium market for wheat and canola. We do sell some barley into the Japanese market, but that is a premium customer. And then you can see the China numbers. Those have taken a hit over the last year with the China embargo on Canadian canola, but it's an extremely important market, and we are selling, continuing to sell high volumes of wheat and barley into the Chinese market. And then look at Indonesia. The Bogasari is the largest milling company, the largest mill of wheat flour in the world. And so those are some of our key markets. If you want to go to the next slide. So this is what's changed. I grew up on a wheat farm in southern Saskatchewan, and in 1975, we were growing half wheat and half summer fallow. The price of wheat in those days was $7 a bushel. If you equated that $7 wheat price to today, it would be $33 a bushel. But it's not. It's still $7 a bushel and change. And that's why farms have diversified in a significant way in Western Canada. Let's go to the next slide. So we had trade wars, we had drought, we've had all number of things that have hit farmers in terms of the sustainability of their farms. So what they did throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s is they moved to a conservation cropping protocol, which is continuous cropping as opposed to half summer fallow. They dramatically changed their crop rotations, which I'm going to show in a subsequent slide, and massive changes in technology, which Craig and Jason are going to show. So let's go to the next slide. So this shows you how the crop mix has changed in Canada since 1975. When I was growing up on a farm just south of Regina, summer fallow was the largest acreage crop in Canada. So that's land that was cultivated. The second largest crop was wheat, and it was the dominant crop in Canada, and in particular in Western Canada. And then we saw, barley in a very high position. Barley acres have declined over the years. But what this slide really illustrates is the change from 1975 until today. So you've seen a precipitous change in canola acres, for example. It's skyrocketed into second position, and actually canola and wheat, roughly go back and forth in terms of acreage. But you can see the massive shift away from summer fallow and into continuous cropping. And that was out of necessity because farmers absolutely needed to use those acres to be able to survive. And they also needed to shift their crop mix to be able to be profitable. And so now we see, wheat acres have roughly been stable, barley acres have dropped off. Canola has seen a massive increase over the years, and the shift to continuous cropping has been very significant. Let's go to the next slide. So again, just building on my earlier point, we produce over 32 million metric tons of wheat and durum a year in Canada, and our domestic consumption is 3 million tons. So there really was no worry that we were going to run out of flour. It was just a matter of the logistics. And we're in a position to feed the world. We were known as the breadbasket of the world when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, and that continues to be the case today. It's perhaps with a slightly different crop mix, but we are one of the largest wheat exporters in the world. We have been for a long time, and that's not going to change. Go to the next slide. So again, we're known for our quality. I don't think that will change. And the farming practices that have been adopted and supported by growers like Jason and professional agronomists like Craig Shand will build on the case that I'm making. Our customers do buy from multiple origins, and we need to make sure that we are the leader in terms of sustainability, best management practices, because our customers are demanding that. Let's go to the next slide. the technological advances are just absolutely stunning that we're seeing in the marketplace today in terms of things like weed control, precision agriculture. One of the things that does weigh down the farmer is the amount of regulation. And for example, we do have a carbon tax, a carbon levy in Canada. Farmers are not adequately rewarded. They never have been for the amount of carbon that they sequester in the soil. And that's an ongoing issue that does need to be addressed. And we need to remove barriers to trade. I would say that the top two areas that farmers are most concerned about are the weather and markets. Actually, three: the weather, markets, and transportation. Weather is number one, obviously, but if we can't access those markets due to trade barriers, we're really in a difficult position. And if we don't have the transportation capacity to serve those markets, we're also in difficulty. And the Barton report really, I think, captured the opportunity. It's just how we will take advantage of it. So that might be, if you want to go to the next slide, the end of my presentation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. And good morning, everyone. It certainly is a privilege of mine to be a participant with these two gentlemen who I have a lot of respect for. Tom has done quite a number more Zoom meetings than what I have, but I will do my best. I really feel like I'm in the perfect place here as the middleman for this webinar, as I feel that my presentation not only supports and will reaffirm what Tom has just presented, but it also will set up what Craig is going to tell us. So let's get started. Every year being faced with increased interest about how we as Canadian farmers are growing food. And there is an increasing demand from both our domestic and international markets to ensure that those products that they are buying have been sustainably grown. So you might ask, well, how are Canadian farmers being measured on the sustainability claim? And, we know that Canadian farmers are already producing sustainable crops that have been measured against international sustainability standards. As a baseline, and through just the regulation that Tom spoke of, through regulation alone, Canadian crop production is proven to be amongst the most sustainable in the world. I'm going to give you some great examples of such, and through the use of technology and innovation, beneficial management practices, throughout my presentation here, as well as Craig's. I would like to mention the new crop missions that farmers participate in on an annual basis with Cereals Canada, which is our national cereals organization. They annually take farmers and industry reps around the globe to promote the sale of Canadian grain. And over the last couple of years, we have seen a growth in demand for being able to actually speak about our practices and the sustainability attributes of our Canadian grain. So today, as part of this webinar, I thought it would be a great and excellent opportunity to share a video that was produced by the 4 crop commissions here in Alberta. It will give you a great visual perspective on the how and why farmers here in Alberta are measuring up as being essential and sustainable, and we'll do our part to help the Canadian economy to recover and grow. So please play the video.
Farm sustainability means more and better food for you and your family. Food you can feel good about, knowing where it comes from. Here's how Alberta farmers grow food sustainably.
Everybody's heard of the dirty 30s. Well, part of that is the tillage that they were doing exposed the soil to the elements, and the dry winds blew the topsoil away. That is far less likely to happen with the way that we farm now, because we leave that soil untouched and the straw on the surface attached.
One of the biggest sustainability changes we've made over time has been the adoption of tilling practices. And now we try to work the land as little as possible and let the roots kind of do the tilling for us. And we try to let nature work the ground itself.
20 years ago, we started soil sampling. So we would go out and take core samples out of each field and send those away to a lab, and then we would get an analysis on that soil and tell us what nutrients are there. And so we would be able to fertilize accordingly for whichever crop we wanted to grow. We've got 3 different nutrients that we put on this field. So the really bright white, that's urea or nitrogen. Phosphate is the brown. And then you see some of these kind of little bit off-white, that's the sulfur that we put on. And because we can apply each nutrient individually, we can just apply what's needed. It's as good as it was before.
We have an 8-year crop rotation, and that really promotes good biodiversity. Because of our soil health, our weeds are decreasing, our diseases are decreasing, which gives us an ability to use less chemicals on our farm.
The progress we're making is towards using fewer products. We have been able to use fewer pesticides and manage them more efficiently. Even in the last 10 years, we've seen a huge change in disease pressure, for example, and insect pressure, just given the practices we've employed.
One of the big changes we made on our farm this past couple of years is putting in double-walled fuel tanks. They're a lot safer for the environment because they're double-walled and they're all self-contained. And on top of that, they have automatic shut-off nozzles, so the possibility of any spillage is eliminated.
In the area of social and human capital, our farm employs a variety of full-time and part-time people. They need to be properly trained to make sure that the employees are safe and can run the equipment appropriately. We like to make sure they know where the first aid and fire protection equipment is as well.
Every time our equipment hits the field, it's recorded in our on-tractor, on-combine equipment, and it's data logged. Based on that information, we can find out how much food we've taken off, what it's taken to produce that food, and we can plan for future years so that we can produce more and better food.
I define sustainability as continual improvement. So I'm always trying to improve on what I'm doing, make sure that I'm always learning and leaving everything behind as good or better than the way I found it.
General consumers need to know that we're sustainable. It's important that they know and understand that we care about our lands and we are trying to do our best to maintain the ecosystem for future generations.
Our farm's been here for 3 generations, and if we weren't sustainable in those generations, we wouldn't be able to maintain our business because there's so much to sustainability that includes protecting the environment and trying to be as efficient as we can.
You know, we've implemented lots of different practices on our farm that we believe makes it viable, and that in turn is creating healthier, more nutritious crops, which has been the goal of farmers for hundreds of years, to promote healthy, nutritious crops for consumers.
Consumers need to know that we're sustainable so that they have some trust in what we're doing. This is our backyard, and we're very engaged in what we're doing on the farm and trying to make it always better.
We want people to feel confident that we're doing a good job, that we're looking after our land well, we're producing food that is healthy and nutritious for them to eat.
It's important that consumers know that Alberta farmers are sustainable, because that shows them that they can trust their food supply and that it's going to be there for their children and their children's children.
Okay, so we'll carry on, and I'd like to thank those producers that were part of that video. I think it explains the story quite well. Moving on, the sustainability on my farm can really be measured in different areas, but the 2 that I feel are most important are the economic and the environmental measurements. Farmers across this country have always cared for the land that we grow our crops on, and we have been forced to learn to do more efficiently using less inputs and becoming even more environmentally friendly. In doing this, we're also growing our yields, which equates to more food per acre of land. You may ask how we're doing this. This slide represents some of those aspects that we're doing on our farm. And we have very many innovative and technologically advanced tools that we are putting to use. Are they expensive? Yes, but the return on investment is reasonable. This map just briefly shows all the reference points that I use in my fields where soil samples are taken on a yearly basis. This allows me to follow the 4R protocol, which I think Craig will get into further in his presentation. Next slide, please. As you'll see here, the size of equipment is getting larger. Part of the useful technology we're using is GPS guided steering on this large equipment, and also the use of sectional control on our seeders and our sprayers, which virtually eliminates any overlap within our fields. Next slide, please. This here is just an example of a fertility zone map that I use in one of our fields. And once again, I think Craig has something similar that he will dig deeper into the benefits of using this type of technology. Next slide. So, you know, sustainability on our farm, in order for today's modern crop production, we must constantly be monitoring the progress of our fields, of our businesses. We're continuously trying to improve the way that we grow our crops and keep our businesses sustainable. And my wife always tells me that if I paid as close attention to my own health and well-being as I do my crops, I'd probably live to be 100. So she may be right. Next slide. And finally, the grain sector, through their Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, is currently developing a code of practice as a national initiative for establishing baselines and for communicating the best practices that are above and beyond regulation. These are used by farmers in the grain sector. It does cover some of the most important elements that we operate our farms around, including water and wetland management, biodiversity, and the overall application of our crop inputs. This initiative is being driven by producers like myself, industry, and NGOs, and it will allow us to quantify our farming practices and tell our story better, and to help us continue to build upon public trust. Next slide, and I think that's it for me. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Jason. I guess my goal today, big thanks to the Simpson Centre for allowing myself to participate, and hopefully I can add some valuable information to what Tom and Jason have already presented. My goal today is to talk to you about 5 sustainable farming practices and technologies that we are implementing on farms with our clients. Next slide. First one I'm going to talk about today is no-till and conservation tillage. So the concept of no-till essentially is eliminating tillage and seeding directly into stubble. So the elimination of that tillage has essentially reduced the amount of fuel that's being burnt, diesel fuel, and also the amount of labor that's required. So we're seeing lower emissions and lower cost to the farmer, and also greater efficiency with less passes required over the field. Most farms are able to seed more acres with one drill. And there's also very vast soil health benefits. So over time, we're seeing increased soil organic matter with implementation of no-till practices. We're seeing increased plant available water by eliminating tillage, and that's translating into higher yields. And we're also seeing a reduction in soil erosion. So we've all seen pictures of the dirty 30s where we've had clouds of soil moving with wind. So we're seeing a real reduction in wind and water erosion of soil by utilizing no-till and keeping that stubble in the field. When we look at some numbers from the 2016 Census of Agriculture, specifically, we look at when no-till started, early concept back in 1991, there was 4.8 million acres of no-till in Canada. That has increased to 48.1 million acres in 2016. So that's an increase of 6.7% of farmed acres to 59.2. So I think that's an amazing statistic. And when we look at conventional tillage, when we go back to 1991, there was 49.4 million acres in Canada of conventional tillage. That was 68.9% of the farmed acres, and that has dropped to 14.1 million acres in 2016, or 17.4% farmable acres. So at the end of the day, no-till is good for the grower, it's good for the soil, it's good for the environment, and as well, it is allowing us to sequester and as well. Slide. Can we go to the next slide? Next slide, please. Next talk is an initiative launched several years ago by Fertilizer Canada. It includes formal training and certification targeted to agronomists and agri-retailers. Can we go back a slide, please? It's focused on implementing best management practices with farmers utilizing the 4R principles. What are those 4R principles? Essentially, the right source, so matching the appropriate fertilizer product to the needs of the crop and uptake. So an example of that would be ammonium sulfate versus elemental sulfur with canola. Elemental sulfur isn't immediately available for the crop versus ammonium sulfate is, so that tends to be the product that's used with a crop like canola that has high sulfur requirements. The right rate, so that's matching the amount of fertilizer. We're going to talk a little bit about soil testing here shortly. That's a good example of the right rate. The right time, so this is making nutrients available when the crop needs them at particular times to the growing season. One concept we're currently working with our clients right now is using melted urea or foliar urea applied just after flowering to try and increase protein in wheat. And that comes down to applying the nitrogen at the right time rather than loading it up front. And also the right place. So keeping nutrients in the soil where the crop can use them. So examples of that would be banding nitrogen so that it's less susceptible to loss mechanisms or seed for the crop. Next slide. There's also been some very neat technology that has evolved over the last 10 to 15 years in the industry when it comes to enhanced fertilizer technology. So enhanced fertilizers or fertilizer additives, these products have reduced risk of nitrogen loss to the environment. So the 3 key mechanisms to nitrogen loss are volatilization, which is loss of applied nitrogen to the atmosphere as ammonia gas, leaching, which is movement of nitrate in the soil, typically downwards with water, and denitrification, which typically occurs in wet or waterlogged soils. So the conversion of nitrate or nitrite turns to nitrous oxide, which we know is a very potent greenhouse gas. So these products essentially use urease, nitrification inhibitors, or polymer coatings to reduce the risk of nitrogen loss in the field. The first product, Super U, that's Koch fertilizers, N-Serve and N-Trench are Corteva Canada, nitrogen additives, nitrogen stabilizers, and then ESN, which is a polymer coated urea from Nutrien. Next slide, please. I'm gonna speak, Jason already touched on this. I'm gonna speak on it a little bit as well. Nutrient management planning and soil testing. So we have 2 trucks, very specialized trucks dedicated to soil testing. We basically take a fairly good newer used half-ton, remove the passenger seat, cut a hole in the floor, and we mount a electric over hydraulic cylinder in the cab. We have GPS receiver on the roof and a laptop in the vehicle. Everything we do is GPS benchmarked. So we go out and we take 20 cores per field and we mark the location of each of those core samples so that when we come back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, we can go back to those exact same locations and benchmark how we're doing with our nutrient management in each field. And we take samples 0 to 6 inch and 6 to 24 inch depth. We go with that full 2 feet especially that 6 to 24 inch depth. We want to have a look at the mobile nutrients, particularly nitrogen and sulfur, and find out what's going on there. Nutrient management planning, I went back and looked at the Census of Agriculture. In 2011, only 23.8% of farms in Canada were implementing nutrient management planning in 2011. So we've got a little bit of work to do there. I think I couldn't find any information in the 2016 census, but I think recently we're seeing numbers probably closer to that 30% implementation in the Western Canadian marketplace. Next slide. I'm not going to dig very deeply into this, but the premise around nutrient management and soil testing is we want to get a snapshot of the nutrients that are in the soil. Then we know what we need to grow a certain target yield of each crop so that we can match the fertility program up to what's in the soil to achieve our target yield. So this is just an example of a soil test and the parameters that we're measuring out there in the field. Next slide, please. And then we take that information from the soil test and we use it to generate for our nutrient management plan for that field. So in this particular example, we're shooting for an 88 bushel wheat crop with an application of 80 pounds of nitrogen and 15 pounds of phosphorus, using urea as our nitrogen source and 1152 or MAP as our phosphorus source. Next slide. Going to go into a little bit more detail. Jason's implementing variable rate fertilizer on his farm. That's a big portion of what we do with our clients. We generate our zone maps using near infrared satellite imagery. This is if you look on the left-hand side, this is a shot from the satellite imagery provider that we use from July 1st of 2016. You can see with the near infrared imagery that the higher biomass areas of the field are reflecting more light. So the brighter red colors are the higher biomass portions of the field. The dark areas are the low biomass areas of the field. So we take that information and typically use it to generate a 6 or 7 zone map. And then we go out and we soil test each one of those zones separately. In this particular field here, you can see zone 1, the pink. It essentially, those areas have poor drainage. They tend to have excess water. They have salinity issues. Zones 2 and 3, the red and the brick red, those are high flats and hilltops. Zone 4, the yellow, is mid-slope areas. And then zone 5 and 6, we get into lower parts of the field that are well drained and very productive. Next slide, please. This is just an example of our sample points on a variable rate or zone managed field. So you can see we're taking cores in each one of those zones. Rather than with composite soil testing, we're taking 20 cores from all across the field and mixing them together. We're segregating the samples in each of these zones and keeping them separate. Next slide. This is an example of a variable rate soil test. So now we've got nutrient parameters and soil quality measurements by zone rather than by the entire field. And then again, we're able to take this data and create a 4-hour nutrient management plan for that field, varying the rate of fertilizer across the field dependent on crop needs, so that we're not over applying or under applying any particular area of the field. And you can see from this soil test that we've got significant variability in nutrient levels, particularly nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. And then when we look at the organic matter, you can see we've got a big range of 5-6% on the hilltops to almost 10% in the low well-drained portions of the field. Next slide. This is an example of a variable rate nutrient management plan. So you can see we've got, rather than one fertilizer recommendation like we had on the composite field, we now have 6 zones, and we've got a distinct fertilizer recommendation in each zone targeted to a realistic yield target in each one of those zones, again, so that we're not under or over applying nutrients. Next slide. And this is an example of the prescription that we built for this for this particular field. So you can see our rates of nitrogen or urea in pounds per acre. And basically as that drill is traveling back and forth across the field, applying fertilizer and seed, the GPS is telling the controller and the air cart the location of the unit in the field, and it's applying the rate specific to that location as it travels back and forth across the field. Next slide. So that wraps up my presentation with the 5 sustainable farming practices and technology tactics that we spend a lot of time implementing with our clients, and gives you an agronomist perspective on sustainability in Canadian agriculture. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for all your input and thoughts. It's really interesting to see how we're all involved in the industry, but yet there's a lot of different perspectives on what sustainability is and how it actually is implemented. So now we're actually going to head into the Q&A portion of this. So you guys have been sending in some questions, and feel free to keep sending them. We got some time left here. The first question though, I will shoot over to Tom. And the question is, what role, if any, does irrigation have in both increasing yields and diversifying crops available for export and domestic consumption?
Well, it's got a big role, and I have a number of growers in the irrigation area of southern Alberta, and of course it's also provided a huge diversification opportunity out of traditional crops. So it has a big role. I think the ongoing question is access to those water resources and the cost of implementing or expanding your irrigation pivot system. And again, I hate to come back to carbon levies, but for example, the cost of electricity is driven up by increased carbon taxes. If we go to a $50 per ton carbon levy, what are the implications on the future of irrigation systems? We've seen Saskatchewan make a major investment actually in irrigation infrastructure, which was originally anticipated when Lake Diefenbaker was, when the dam was built in the 60s. And now they're just actually getting into that. So I think there's a lot of issues around water access and the operating costs, and then the land costs also are become significantly inflated, as you probably know in your area, Kara. There's a lot of irrigation in southern Alberta, and the cost of expansion is one of the biggest obstacles.
And while we're on the topic of irrigation and water management, we have another question that says, what percentage of Alberta's cropland is irrigated versus not? And is that number increasing due to climate change?
Wow. Anybody know I don't think it's, I don't know the percentage. Craig?
Yeah, I'd have to do some digging on that one. I would say it's concentrated primarily in southern Alberta, south of Highway 1. And even, I don't do a lot of irrigation work. Most of my clients are in the Highway 2 corridor, Calgary to Innisfail area, where we're naturally irrigated. Maybe too much this year, but even the growers that I do work with that have irrigation, their entire farm tends to not necessarily be irrigated. They may have a portion of the farm that's irrigated and a portion of the farm that's dry land. And my understanding is because that irrigated land is expensive to purchase, and it costs a lot of money to put up an irrigation pivot as well. So,
well, and to that point, and most of the growers that I know that have irrigation in southern Alberta, they've been able to adapt their dryland farming practices to be able to deal with lack of moisture. So for example, we've had some drought years. We've had really, up until this year, probably 3 to 4 years of successive drought in southern Alberta, but they've still been able to grow crops, whereas in 2001 and 2, or in 1988 and 89, they had nothing. So so it, again, it's kind of a balancing act of how much investment you're going to put into your farm.
I would add to that. Oh, go ahead, Jason.
Sure, Craig. Yeah, I'll maybe just chime in on the topic of water management and irrigation water. Where I'm at, northwest of Red Deer, like Craig says, we're very well self-irrigated through rainfall, and our farm actually incorporates tile drainage to remove excess water from our land. And when you consider the size of Alberta, that's only within 2.5 hours that there's that kind of extremes in our water management.
Absolutely.
I would say too, to add to that, I think water use efficiency is a big sustainability measuring stick. So, whether it's irrigation or dry land, I think we've come a long ways with our practices. Even something like no-till has really increased the amount of plant available water. If we were still farming like we were in the 50s and 60s, we wouldn't be growing the crops we are currently using the technology we're using now. So.
Absolutely. So the next question comes, any of you feel free to chime in on it, but it is, how does one reconcile the need for individual farmer sustainability for the next generation farmer on the one side with food production sustainability for future consumers on the other side? So for example, carbon taxes have been accepted as behavior changing for a sustainable environment, yet farmers are fighting them because of their own profitability. How do you reconcile these positions?
I'll take a stab at that. So I think it comes back to, farmers have voluntarily changed their practices, which have ended up being beneficial to the environment, but have not been credited for those changes. So minimum or zero tillage is a perfect example of where, we've had a carbon offset program for farmers, but it, after the first year or two, it doesn't really pencil out anymore. And I think farmers would be more accepting of having a behavioral changing levy, like a carbon tax on their grain drying, for example, and it's embedded in the cost of their inputs as well, if they could get some recognition for what they've actually done to adapt, because most of the changes have already been made on farms like Jason's or Craig's clients, where they've already made those changes, but they really haven't received any significant benefit.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add here. I think that's the definition of a true offset for us as farmers, is to have that recognition for the practices that we've already been doing for a number of years that Craig and I mentioned, and to have continue to be taxed on some of the things that we're doing at the farm, and including the price of drying grain. It just really kind of digs deeper into the overall financial side of our operations. It makes it much more difficult with lower margins.
Like, just to add one more point to that, I think farmers are stewards of the land, and we all want to. I farm as well, and I want to leave my soil in better shape than when I started for the next generation, and I think that's a key point as well. But on the flip side, we also need the economics to be there to be sustainable as well. We have to be able to make a penny or two.
Absolutely. So another comment here we have, it says, it is heartwarming to see the grain industry is putting substantial effort to push for sustainable farming. Are farmers supported sufficiently by the government or other agencies to make the technology changes if they don't have the financial backings?
I'll take the first crack at that one, Kara. I would say no. I think it all comes back to what we talked about earlier about the recognition that the investment that we're making on our farms to become more sustainable. And the best example I have of that is on much of the newer lines of equipment, tractors, combines, sprayers. We've been forced to make significant investments in greenhouse gas reducing equipment, things such as diesel exhaust fluid systems on our tractors. That added substantially to the cost of that equipment, and yet we still have not been recognized for doing that, and that's become very frustrating.
Anyone else have comments on that?
I would just add there are some economic benefits to the farm when it comes to some of these tactics as well. So something like variable rate technology that often enables us to use less fertilizer, less pesticide, which is a real win for the environment, but it's also a win for the farmer's pocketbook as well, because he doesn't have to purchase quite as much when it comes to dollars of inputs as well. So I think the tactics that are most successful are the ones that are sustainable, but also make a financial difference on the operation as well. Less diesel fuel with no-till would be another example.
And playing into you talking about variable seeding rate, we have a question here asking Craig if you use variable rate seeding on your farm and what benefits you think it provides.
I think, I guess the science around variable rate seeding, at least to me, isn't quite settled yet. It's something we're looking at and playing with. It makes sense to me that if you're getting onto a hilltop or a dry ridge where you've got less plant available water, you probably want to have a lower plant stand because it's not going to support the growth that other areas of the field are, versus when you get into a low spot with high yield potential, we maybe want to have a higher plant stand to support that yield potential. And there's maturity factors involved in that as well. Those low spots tend to be take longer to mature. The hilltops tend to mature faster, so there's some benefits of potentially evening that crop out as well. So it's something we're still looking at, and I think there's growth potential for that as well.
Absolutely. So a question here is, would inset carbon markets where corporate buyers are willing to pay not just for the commodity, but for monetizable carbon credits help? I don't know, Tom, if you want to take a stab at that one.
Sure, it would help. So Alberta was a pioneer in terms of offering carbon offsets to farmers. Actually, the previous Conservative government put a price on large emitters in 2007. And so we had a bit of a carbon credit market that evolved in Alberta in the late 2000s, like 2007 and on. But at the end of the day, it's not proven to be a reliable system, and we need a formal protocol to be able to for farmers to be able to capitalize on that. And I think we actually have the ability to be a world leader in that space because of our history in terms of actually taking a leadership role on putting a price on large emitter carbon. But it's kind of gotten all balled up in the carbon tax debate, and so it's become very political. I think that some sort of a pragmatic approach to carbon trading and putting an actual value, sustainable value, on what farmers are contributing in terms of sequestering carbon in the soil would be a very desirable outcome. And I think it's going to come, but it's just finding the right formula, to be perfectly honest. There's a lot of resistance at the government level to share that information, what farmers are actually sequestering. The federal government has been reluctant to share that data. So, but I think it's an honorable pursuit for sure.
And with the extreme weathering pattern we have seen in the recent years, and likely more in the future, farmers seem to be only on the receiving end. Is there anything the sector can be actively pursuing to minimize the loss?
Weather happens every year for sure, Karen, and certainly we may be seeing a few more extremes than what we have in the past. But I think, for us as farmers, we really look at our crop rotation as being a key factor in mitigating some of that. You know, we have a number of crops that we're starting to grow. Faba beans, for example, that's actually do like to grow under higher moisture conditions. So I think, you know, between that and the good work that our plant breeders are doing in building up some genetic resistance to some of those drought stresses and other environmental stresses, I think that's something that we're doing to help mitigate those weather extremes.
I would add to that, grain drying is probably one thing in the Highway 2 corridor of Alberta that is experiencing a bit of a growth curve right now. So we're seeing with some wetter falls, and it's been difficult to get the crop harvested, we're seeing a lot more growers invest in grain drying equipment. I guess some of the feedback I'm hearing from growers is there would be welcome to have some assistance there, particularly when it comes to investment in the technology and also the additional cost of the carbon tax on the propane and the natural gas that's used to dry that grain.
And oftentimes when we think sustainability, we are thinking environmental, but can you guys touch a bit about the importance of taking care of ourselves and taking care of the people around us when it actually comes to keeping our farms sustainable?
I think I might have mentioned that in the video that I presented, Kara, in that, you know, every year, you know, it seems like our margins are getting tighter, but at the same time, we do have had the ability to increase our yields. So that's where we've really gained is the amount of crop or amount of food per acre that we've been able to grow. And that certainly helps the bottom line. But things that we've talked about here today, such as the carbon tax, you know, those are the ones that we don't have any control over and certainly are impacting the overall financial sustainability of our farms.
Absolutely. And playing off of that as well, we have a comment here that says very extensive management practices shown. How does producer training play into this to support long-term sector sustainability, if any? Is there any sector direction to enhance this?
That's a good question. I think certainly having people like Craig, you know, the agronomists that we all work with closely, those people really help us to understand what more we can do to become even more productive. And I think, you know, we do have associations and organizations here in Canada that you know, really do provide good extension, whether it's research extension, agronomy, or anything like that, to producers who are looking for it.
Any other comments on that?
Well, again, I don't farm, I work for farmers, but what I've seen over the course of my career is an explosion in professional advisors like Craig in the marketplace. You know, it used to be that you had your local extension agrologist that worked for the government, and but I think out of necessity, farmers are seeking expert advice to try to, whether it's marketing, whether it's agronomy or farm business management, to really get that edge to. And I know Jason is a user of many of those services, so it's definitely changed in that regard, because you just absolutely have to have it, and unless you're an expert in everything, and that's usually not the case.
No, absolutely. So a question here says there's a carbon credit system in Alberta that farmers can participate in related to the large emitters regulation. What percentage of farmers access that, and is it significant?
I can tackle that a little bit. I think I'm not sure what the percentage of acres are without doing some research on that. I would suspect it's relatively low. I would say I've been involved in carbon credits over the last decade or more. I would say the feedback from my clients, for the most part, has been that for $1 to an acre, the paperwork is pretty onerous, and they're not feeling that the reward is sufficient. at the end of the day. So currently anyway, with the current market.
So we have time for one or two more questions here. With farmers becoming a smaller and smaller proportion of the voting public, how do farmers get their point of view known to the voting public, especially related to things like sustainability? How do we break the barrier between the urban and the rural divide?
Well, I can answer that one, Kara. I think a lot of the voting public doesn't realize how organized farmers are, and in particular over the last 6 or 7 years, we do have organizations such as the one that Tom works for that represent us very well on the provincial front, and that just expands out to nationally, where we actually do have the opportunity to meet with government leaders in Ottawa and throughout Canada to get our points across. I think, you know, as far as the rest of the public, they just don't realize that we are that organized and have that much structure in what we're doing as far as how do people represent us.
So then how do we, any suggestions on how we can make them realize?
Well, that video that I showed is a start, but you know, we can do as much as we can, you know, to advertise that or to get that out there. But as you know, in order to get that messaging out and to do it very effectively and get to the masses, it needs to be done, you know, via radio or television. And those are the most expensive types of advertising. And that becomes a bit of a barrier to do that.
And I think it's fair to say that we spend more and more of our time trying to influence government policy at the provincial and federal level and getting in front of politicians. Jason and I have been down to Ottawa many times and talking to urban MPs and trying to impress our story upon them. But, you know, ultimately agriculture contributes a huge, it may be that we're small in numbers of voters, but our contribution to the gross domestic product of Canada is massive. And so we just need to do a better job of impressing upon our decision makers the impact that we do have.
So we'll address one last question here. It says, given what has happened to the energy markets of the world, do our provincial and federal politicians understand that agriculture is most likely the biggest sector for GDP and employment in our new world? Value-added projects in Canada can save our rural communities and increase employment. Does anyone have any comments on this?
Sounds like a Tom question to me.
Well, we hope so. And I'm actually on an economic ag and forestry economic sector table with John Simpson that is trying to impress upon our provincial government the important role that agriculture and forestry can play in the recovery of the Alberta economy, because we know it's going to take some time for the energy sector to rebound, and it's going to take some time for tourism and others. We've shown our resiliency in agriculture in particular, and so we're making that case for sure that that's a key area. It should be a key area of focus, both provincially and nationally. It's the best I can do.
I'll just quickly add, Kara, I think you'd mentioned the importance of value-added processing as being something that would be beneficial to us in the agricultural, in particular to primary producers. And, you know, if we just look at, you know, we have 2 major malt plants here in Alberta, as well as some canola crushing plants. Those are the ones that really give us a chance to direct market some of our products, and then to have them, you know, do their value-added processing and just enhance the quality of crops that we're growing here in Western Canada or across the country.
Great. Well, that is all we have time for today. I know it's a topic that I'll talk about probably all day. But it was great having you guys all on board here today, Craig, Tom, and Jason. And for those of you watching, there will be a follow-up email that includes a survey as well as a link to the recording. So if you could participate in that, that would be fantastic as well. It was, like I said, it was great having you all, and have a great rest of your day. And we will talk to you all soon.
Thanks,
Thank
Tara.
you.
Great job.
Yeah.